And welcome to day 2 of our Climate Change and Environmental Justice Week of our October Action Summit. We have a great lineup of speakers for you today. First, we'll have Amali Tower and Lolita Jackson discussing the threats and risks with climate change, disaster, and displacement. And then later this afternoon, we'll hear from 3 of our own WIL members and state representatives, Nevada State Senator Pat Spearman, Rhode Island State Senator Don Auer, and Florida State Representative Anna Escamani. So if this is your first time joining us, I just want to give a few reminders about the platform. So as a reminder, all of our sessions are being recorded and can be found under the recordings tab at the end of each week. You can find all of our sessions for the entire month under schedule, and you can add them right to your calendar right through the platform under the title name. You'll see the option to add to the calendar. Feel free to pose any questions in today's session by using the Q&A function in the chat box over there to your right. And we also invite you to interact with our speakers by using the emojis towards the bottom of this screen. So what I'm going to do here, I'm going to introduce our panelists, give a brief introduction, and then have a moderated discussion for about 30 minutes or so, and then we'll open it up to the audience for Q&A. So to introduce our panelists, I'm excited. We have Lolita Jackson. She is the Executive Director of Communications and Sustainable Cities for Sustainable Development Capital. It's a $1 billion London-based climate finance and investment firm. She previously worked for the New York City Mayor's Office for 15 years, doing a variety of roles. And up until March of 2021, so just this year, she served as the Special Advisor for Climate Policy and Programs, where she was the climate diplomat and lead for the administration regarding global work and divestment of climate finance. She is the 2007 winner of the Penn Alumni Award of Merit, and in May this year, she was named the member of the Most Excellent Order of the British Empire. She is a 1989 alumna of the Penn School of Engineering, majoring in applied science with a concentration in chemical engineering. Yay, STEM. And then we are also joined by Amali Tower. She has an extensive experience promoting the rights and protection of refugees and forcibly displaced persons in a variety of contexts, including resettlement, protection, evaluation, and research with UNHCR, so that's the UN Human Rights Council, and the various NGOs and U.S. refugee admissions programs throughout Africa, Asia, and the Middle East, and here in the U.S. She's resettled refugees, campaigned for refugee and asylum protections, written and passed U.S. legislation to curb immigration detention, and she's a member of the World Economic Forum and expert network in migration, human rights, and humanitarian response. She has a master's in international affairs from UCLA and international diploma in humanitarian assistance from Fordham University. She's also, I'd be remiss to say, the founder of Climate Refugees, which is how I found her a little while ago, a few years ago, and invited her here. So to give us a little welcome to our panelists, hello to you two, and then to give us a little bit of a frame here for our discussion, I'll kick that off. So as we have in the description, right, climate change can act as an accelerant of instability. It contributes to water and food scarcity, the spread of disease, and mass migration. Increasing global temperatures are causing drought, flood, famine, disease, bigger storms, and spurring more conflicts. Amid famine, storms, and struggling economies, people will start to move from where they live. The movement of millions of people can put a strain on surrounding areas, destabilizing whole towns, cities, nations, and regions of the world. The Internal Displacement Monitoring Center estimates that a total of 7 million people will be displaced across the globe in 2020, or were displaced in 2020 due to national disasters. And within the US, a total of 126,000 people were displaced as a result of wildfires, severe storms, and hurricanes. And that was just in 2020. Additionally, the latest report from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which is a climate science body of the United Nations, made clear that the climate crisis is well underway and some changes like sea level rise are irreversible. So government leaders around the world need to prepare for mass migration due to climate disaster, and those fleeing impacted areas will need to resettle. and the unaffected communities and nations will need to prepare to receive those migrants. So I want to go right into questions here. I'm going to pose the questions to both of you. So you just jump right in, and then we'll grab questions as we see them from the audience. So first question here is: the groundswell report released by the World Bank earlier this year predicted that by 2050, without concrete climate and development action, climate change could lead to more than 216 million people in 6 regions to migrate within their own countries. The report did not make predictions for the US, but I want to ask you, how do these numbers compare to what we might see here in terms of internal climate migration in the US over the next years or decades?
Well, I can take a stab and start with this. So, one of the things that is part of my background is that I work in the climate team for New York City after Hurricane Sandy in particular. I was one of the leads on the resilience report that we wrote after Hurricane Sandy, and a lot of research went into that. And we recognize that it's not just even storms that will cause people to have to leave their neighborhoods. The wildfires, as Rakia mentioned earlier, displaced massive amounts of people from California. Whole communities such as Paradise, California, are just completely wiped out. Even if they rebuild, those people have to live somewhere else in the interim. In New York City, we found that because we can't just put FEMA trailers where people can live in trailers, we had to find places that those people could relocate. So there's going to be a lot more issues around internal migrations as the days come in further years, particularly sea level rise. New York City is a coastal city, 520 miles of coastline. There will be areas that people simply will not be able to live once sea level rise happens. And Miami's already suffering through this as well, with the subsidence of the land actually sinking while sea levels are rising. So I think you're going to see a lot more of movement in the years to come. Also, water scarcity will cause that. Lake Powell, there are many reports coming out that the Lake Powell, the levels are the lowest they've ever been. If we have less snow melt, that's going to continue to be impacted. So we're looking at many, many issues that are not just acute and storm related, but long-term issues that will keep people on the move in the U.S.
What about you, Molly?
Yeah, to that I would add that, just like anywhere else in the world, in the United States, where there is vulnerability to this is amongst the poorest of the poor. And so, climate change is very much a social protection issue that is I think still missing in our conversation. And as part of the problem is that for so long we've purely looked at this as an environmental issue, and really that thus missed how much climate change actually fragments and disrupts entire sectors of society. It's very much a political and socioeconomic issue for much of the world, which is why I say that it is akin to persecution for much of the global South. In the United States, it's really the same exact dynamics at play for the most poverty-stricken, for the most marginalized, for any BIPOC community in the United States that is on the receiving end of any marginalization of redlining, where there is environmental racism and where there has been high rates of toxic waste dumps and pollution. We have records that show, right, there are higher incidences of pollution and climate change and public health. And we have the data to actually show where there are geographic locations that correlate to where there are actually plants in particular regions, and where race is an indicator, in fact, or socioeconomic status. So these things all have to be looked at through an interdisciplinary lens. And it's not just disasters that cause people to have to be displaced or be forced to migrate. It's the slow onset impacts of climate change. And Ile de Jean-Charles in Louisiana, the sinking coastlines of Louisiana, the Gulf, anywhere in the Deep South, really. Newtok, Alaska, where a population of indigenous people, it took over 20 years to move one tribe, and they still haven't all moved. The indigenous people of Ile de Jean-Charles, as I said, it's well over 50 years, and the whole reason they're even living where they are is because they were forced to live due to political, gross, egregious human rights conditions that are really underpinning why they even live there. They live on uninhabitable lands to begin with. So you really have to look at this through a much wider lens in order to understand why climate change is forcing people to migrate. And I will say it's important to realize too that the World Bank said 216 million people could be at risk of internal migration if we fail to take the following actions. And that report is based on 3 different scenarios.
Thank you for expounding on that. I know what I was going to say in the beginning is I know you are, you're in the region or an area where, as you mentioned, the Groundswell report had done research. And I want to correct myself from before. UNHCR, I've been doing a lot of human rights thinking, so that's where it came. It's the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees. I think that's important to know.
Yes.
Yeah. You mentioned you gave great examples, both of you, on what climate events we've seen in recent years that has caused mass, internal displacement. So I want to ask you now about some of those drivers. Can you talk a little bit more? Can you dive in more about those drivers here in the U.S. that are not storm related? Because I think when folks think about some of the climate drivers that cause folks to move, they definitely think about Sandy, they think about Katrina. And so what are some of those other, climate drivers that are out there that can cause folks to move internally and migrate?
Well, there's 2 that I have. To expound on the Miami example, because particularly in South Florida, as I said, the land is sinking at the same time sea level is rising. That's a multiplier effect. And what's happening now is climate gentrification. So areas that were seen as not desirable to live in because they weren't near the beach, now people want to move inland and move on higher ground, and they're moving to those non-beach communities, and that's where many Black and brown people live. So now those folks who've lived there forever are getting priced out of being able to buy homes there, and that we're going to see more of that as people move away from coastal communities and try to move inland. In particular, there's something that I think the legislators here need to know. There's going to be a rise in flood insurance. So there's a federal legislative act. It's on the docket right now to allow flood insurance rates to rise to the levels of the actual or close to the actual levels of risk. This was staved off after Hurricane Sandy. They had it was called the Bigger Waters Act, and they wanted to enact this after Hurricane Sandy, and a number of legislators came through and basically were able to push that to the side. But that is coming up now, and that will substantially make the cost of owning a home in those areas much more, to the point that some folks may not be able to sell their homes in the areas that they live in now. So you're going to see significant results if that bill does come to pass.
Yeah, I'll just add to what Lolita said. She's absolutely right. And this is really points to how the multiplier effect and the ways in which people are impacted by something that we purely see as environmental, and to do so is to sort of miss what those residual impacts, can look like. But remember too, if you're moving, if you're able to move and even get ahead of something, so the situation in Miami, for example, if Miami were a country, it would be like the 4th most at risk country in the world because of where it sits. And let's also not forget that Miami is developed on porous limestone. The same situation exists in the Florida Keys. And so is it Monroe County? Because every time I hear that, I think of Alabama, and I'm just like, that can't be right. But I believe that is the name of the county. They've passed, this monumental bill in the billions to actually relocate populations in the Keys, and still there isn't enough money to move everybody that is at risk. And the Florida Keys, of course, have several little islands, that dot its shores. And many of the people that live along those little dotted shores live in trailers and are immigrants or low income populations who probably won't be relocated. And that's well known and well documented. So imagine passing legislation that says, we know we don't have enough money to move everybody. And yeah, that's a problem. I mean, to have an environmental problem be bigger than the state legislation can even handle speaks volumes then about our ability to respond as at a municipal, at a federal, at a state level. But what does that say about people then at the individual level who have no means? We're talking about trapped populations migrating, whether that be at the local level, global level. It is almost a privilege. Now, let me not get that mixed up though. In the context of climate change, you're talking about people who are forced into circumstances where migration is survival or adaptation. It's still, though, it requires resources. And in the context of what we're talking about here in the United States, those resources I'm talking about are money. In the context of global and borders, I'm talking about access. I'm talking about, the right to move. So what really is also at stake here is the ability to move, which means money. And secondly, to be in a situation where your life is not going to be at risk, whether that be to a disaster or the slow onset impacts of climate change and the ways in which that degrades your existence.
Painting such a dim picture, but I appreciate all of the candor and truth. Because it's the truth. It's a great segue into my next question, actually, is just that, Amali, what you hit on, how have cities and states responded to that mass influx of internal climate migrants here in the US? Have they been prepared to intake, such large numbers? And then if you can share with us how they could have been better prepared.
Well, I can start with that because in New York City, we actually saw that. New York City is a place that is one of the most diverse cities in the world. So anywhere, not even just in the US, but in the world that a disaster happens, there's going to be people coming to New York City, whether it's something that happens in Bangladesh, the Haiti earthquake, many people came in 2010. But also we saw recently with Hurricane Maria, because Maria happened in Puerto Rico. And so many people came from Puerto Rico and went straight to Florida, Orlando area, or New York City. So what we needed to do was make sure those people were able to have housing if they did not have relatives in the area, put the children in school. It's very important to make sure those children still can continue their schooling, providing food. So in New York City, we have a very robust nonprofit sector, and many nonprofit organizations came in, as well as philanthropy. So we now set up a system. We have the Mayor's Fund for New York City, where people can actually donate money directly to that fund, and those funds can then be dispersed to either those nonprofits or to the entities that can help them directly, such as entities that provide food. But there was a system of folks that came together in the mayor's office specifically to handle this. And that was pretty much the first one that we had just a mass migration of folks that were US citizens. As I said, we had past ones where it was Haiti earthquake and other things that happened in other countries. But we now, I think, have in place, if this happens again in another city where people come to New York, we'll be ready. And we really learned from Katrina, where 250,000 people were on the move from southern Louisiana and moved to Texas and other states in the South. And then they were also hit by Hurricane Rita not long after they arrived. So there were a lot of issues around that many cities around the country watched that and learned from.
Yeah, exactly. I think the fires as well, like in Paradise, California, it shows and it speaks to how people who had the means to move will move. And Hurricane Katrina and Rita and a lot of the examples that Lolita points to, are really examples of what you see happen more often, which is when people are displaced by disasters, they oftentimes, I think people think that, you're displaced by a disaster, FEMA assists you, and then that's your one and only time of displacement. You can be impacted by a disaster and live in displacement for a very long time. And even at the international level, the Internal Displacement Monitoring Center, Rikia, who you mentioned in your opening comments, they'll also write about this, and they'll point to that there isn't like a less amount of risk of the long-term impacts that people have to their human security by being displaced by a disaster. You can still be in very long and entrenched situations, much like refugees are in conflict. So, and we're seeing that happen. I mean, there are people who were displaced by Katrina who have still not actually have a home to return to. Sandy's the same story in New York City, you know, which is where both Lolita and I live. And when you look at what the latest IPCC report says, and when you look at the lack of preparedness, and when you look at the levels of the very poor levels of mitigation, and when I'm talking about emissions levels that the most polluting countries have, and the United States being the biggest historic emitter, you know, and the 100-odd corporations or so that are really responsible for all this, we're not going in the right trajectory. So, you know, I'm just pointing out the data, the statistics, and these things are incongruous to each other. So, what will be the tipping point? Climate. That's why we're having these conversations. And who's on the front lines of it? The most vulnerable populations. What does that look like? That usually looks like lifelong displacement.
The folks who were affected in Paradise, because I listen to NPR every morning, and that was a story for a long time, is listening to the folks who were hoping to get back into their homes. They really wanted to rebuild there. So that, I appreciate you mentioning that, because that resonated with me anyway. I want to go into, you know, you had mentioned the groundswell report talked about that 80% of, you know, climate migration could be reduced if we act on some of these pressures. So now I want to go to what, you know, state legislators could do to help reduce some of those climate pressures, and how could they build more resilient communities so that, you know, folks can stay where they are.
Well, I'll just say two things. Even though New York City, thankfully, we get you know, a supply of water from upstate New York, so we don't have to worry about our water. But I know there are many communities that are in the Sun Belt that are growing and growing exponentially, and there are going to be water issues because much water actually goes to agriculture. So if there's a way to legislate or think through how water is really used in these communities that are going to be impacted by hotter temperatures and also water scarcity. So I would say if there's a way to legislate water use to be better for communities and not just for agriculture, that's one. And then the other is just making sure that there is resilient housing built. One of the things that I was going to bring up also is that in New York City, we just had 13 people die from a recent hurricane, Hurricane Ida, because they drowned in their basements because the basements were illegal apartments. And many of those folks are undocumented. We also saw this happen in Hurricane Sandy, where there were people living in places we didn't even know existed, because if you had a mortgage of $3,000 a month, maybe you rented out your basement apartment and we didn't know it because it was not legislated to be able to be used in that way. And so there were people living in spaces we didn't know about who were undocumented, excuse me. So if there's a way to look through, you know, making those housing units compliant so people can actually be legally on the books for using them. And so if there's an extreme heat or storm or something that we know that people live there, that they live there safely, and that we're allowing those apartments to be used. Because as we all know, there's housing scarcity across the country. So making sure that people have places to live that are safe, that are compliant, and that will that they won't drown in their homes. That also happened during Sandy. Is paramount. So I think the legislators who are listening to the calls can think through resilient housing and ensuring that those basement apartments and places that are below the floodplain are made safer for folks in an economical way where they can actually live there through subsidy or helping them to become compliant.
Yeah, I would say that, you know, oh, okay. I would say that, you know, I think there's a need overall on a very macro level for us to think about shared resources, you know, as states and then as a country. Under the previous administration, you know, because the United States pulled out of the Paris Agreement, there was a big uptick in cities, you know, taking an international pledge and saying that, you know, we would, and, you know, you had the C40 and you had all these different movements. Okay. They're still very active, and that's so wonderful and welcome. And it shows what can happen at, if the individual level, but at this case it was at the city level, right? But at the municipal level, it doesn't matter. What I'm trying to say is it captures what one can do at a communal level as well. And I think that is the heart of the response that we all need to be espousing more, because it really does come down to shared resources, a shared planet, and our more American individualism type of mindset isn't going to get it done. So to think about, to follow on Lolita's point of view about water and what state you might be bringing water in from, the time has long come and passed for us to think, is it really necessary for me to be watering my front yard and hosing down the leaves? My whole family lives in Southern California, where there's been a drought for I don't know how long. And I don't know how long I heard that neighborhood conflict go on, was I going to report my neighbor who was hosing down his front yard? And I would come back from New York City and be thinking, we're still talking about this, because, and it speaks to me about some things not connecting, that there's a bigger issue. So we all need to rise to recognize what we're all connected to and a part of.
I 100% agree with that. I want to get the question in the chat here from Tina. Is anyone, so let me go ahead so everyone can see it. She asks, is anyone working on food security in relation to disaster preparedness and response? Hawaii is unique with only a 3-day supply of food any given day, and relief a 5-day sail away.
Well, on the micro level, I can tell you that New York City, this was front of mind after Hurricane Sandy, because Hurricane Sandy was a tidal event, meaning if it was high tide in a different area of the city, in the Bronx, 50% of the food in New York City goes to one place, and that place is in the floodplain. So we immediately realized that we needed to not only make that resilient, but make sure that the trucks that bring that food in would be able to get to New York City. So part of our resilience plan in 2013 actually has an entire chapter on food. And I'm sure that other cities around the country started thinking through how they were going to be able to get their food in if they, like Hawaii, are not necessarily growing all the foods that they need. So definitely I can tell you on a local level, that's a topic. And also I know California is dealing with this. And actually I'm having an event, a side event during COP26, where the Food and Agriculture Secretary of California is going to speak at our event talking about these issues as well.
I will say that as far as food security goes, let me give you kind of like a global picture. I've done some work in the Lake Chad Basin where there's a conflict, and there's also a lot of climate change issues going on, and over 5 million people are now displaced. And they're displaced because of conflict, because of climate change, and because of a complex, situation, which, by the way, is not uncommon to most conflict scenarios as well. So just as what we're talking about here on the domestic lens is also important to understand at the global lens, is that, nobody really moves. Things have never been one-dimensional. It's never just like there's a conflict, I was forced out of my home, I left. There are always a series of factors that sort of escalate. And climate change, wherever it's happening and to whom, takes on much of the same type of scenarios. And what I would say is that, food security there is a massive issue in the Sahel, and what's often said is that, is it conflict that is the main barrier to the food security issues there, or is it climate change? And we could go back and forth with this, but it's a little bit of both. And it really comes back down to then, what is the crux of the issue that we need to be responding to? And that's human security. And that's why you can't really respond to these things with, a border security or a military lens on things. You really need to understand that what you're trying to do is address things by grounding and increasing individual human rights. So if you're talking about food security, you're talking about systems that make people's protection and access to food universal and accessible regardless of disasters that can affect a supply chain route at any time, by the way. regardless of fuel prices, regardless of whether a country is going to be a spoiler or going to be a contributor to whether we're going to be dependent on fossil fuels or not. All of these things will play a role in the food supply chain. Can't be an outlier. You're either going to be cooperative and you're going to make those cooperative mechanisms that are all really comes down to, are we all collectively trying to elevate human security, or are we trying to elevate border security or military security? So it's like a global lens of looking at food security, which take the, you can like bring that down to the microcosms and different ways in which it looks, but at the end of the day, the heart of the matter is still the same.
Absolutely. So I think I told you, I did tell y'all, we had from a war economy to a green economy actually on Tuesday, and hit on that panel hit on a lot of the same points that you both just made, but definitely you, Molly, about human security. And that's one thing that we espouse here at One Will, is the importance of human security and what that looks like in the 21st century. Yes, and beating back militarism. So thank you for that. Please add more questions in the chat. I'm going to go back to my planned questions that I had for the panelists. So I want to stay on this point about building resilient communities. And even with the efforts for cities and states to try to build resilient communities and keep people in their homes and so they don't have to move, are there some places here in the US that actually will be unable to save? And what steps should legislators take to prepare for this?
I have a couple of sort of touch point things that could probably happen. New York City actually has its own New York City panel for climate change. And we've had that since 2007, where they have utilized scientists as well as people on staff for New York City to actually do the research and come up with our own maps. So we actually were successfully able to challenge the FEMA maps that were printed for New York City because they did not incorporate sea level rise. And that happened in 2014, where we actually won that challenge. So we know what our sea level rise picture is going to look like and what our map is going to look like. But in addition to that, we've already had about a foot over the last 100 years of sea level rise. And so since we are a coastal community and coastal city, there has been landfill that has, so Battery Park City is on landfill, the World Trade Center was on landfill. And so we recognize that water is going to go to where it originally went. And if you look at the map, the old map of New York City and Hurricane Sandy's water map, the water went exactly where it used to be. So when you look at that and know that, there are some communities that people probably shouldn't have ever lived. And what we did after Hurricane Sandy is that the state of New York actually bought people out. So they said, you know what, this needs to go back to wetland because it actually protected a much larger area. So two things I would say is prepare for, that term is called managed retreat. We actually take back that land and bring it back to where it should have, what it was always and what it should be in the future. The second thing is, as I said about the flood maps, ensure that the maps for your community are accurate so that you know what the picture is going to be in 50 years, 100 years with the accurate localized data. So maybe having legislation that you have to produce those maps, because New York City actually has that, we wrote that into legislation where those maps have to be done, that panel has to meet to do those flood projections. And that's really helpful. Those are two sort of concrete things that I would say.
Absolutely. I'm so glad Lolita mentioned that, because I had a panel on during Climate Week where a disaster risk reduction technologist was on, and a professor over at Miami-Dade College who spoke about the maps, mentioned a few places, but Staten Island was one of the places where the flood maps were wrong, and there's probably a whole lot of reasons for this that Lolita could speak to that I wouldn't know about. But I have to say, my mind also goes to some of those social issues I mentioned, Rakia, and where there are places that have been overlooked, that risk is probably a little bit higher, right? Where places haven't been well mapped, and I don't just mean for risk, but I mean just well mapped, meaning they've kind of fallen under, the radar. There's probably going to you're going to want to take another look, because you're going to want to look at what are the social protections that we may have missed, that now under a different risk lens take on different problems that we may as legislators, well, not me, but those listening, may need to look at through very different lenses, right? So, and I would say, as someone who's done a lot of resettlement, refugee resettlement, and there's a lot of different ways in which you do that. But one of the ways in which I've done that is readying cities for groups that resettle. And I've done this by talking to state refugee coordinators, or I've gone to smaller cities. I just done this recently with the Afghan evacuations, or we're all in the process of doing all of this now. But there's a lot of capacity and knowledge that these types of civil servants have as well. And I would say draw on those resources right now, because you are in a way, you're also, again, having to look at the capacity of your cities. You're going to have to look at then forecasting what some of those additional needs might be. What are your risks? Looking at the mapping that Lolita was mentioning, and then it's a question of like asking yourself, well, what is my readiness, and what are the things that I need? And then when you look at that through some of those examples I mentioned about Miami, for example, it's going to really shine a light on who might be left behind. To go back to Miami, let me tell you one more really sad and scary thing that maybe people don't recognize. Miami climate gentrification, which is a term that Harvard coined because of what was called planned relocation, now managed retreat, because it's a more palatable term. The uber rich are moving inland in order to save their homes, and by doing so, they are gentrifying neighborhoods that were once not so desirable. In the process, there is a great risk of displacing. This is the term that's being used, which is very interesting to someone who comes from forced migration and displacement. The term being used is displacement of Miami residents that live in Little Haiti. And who lives in Little Haiti? We're talking about refugees from Haiti that the United States resettled. We're talking about immigrants. We're talking about people of color. We're talking about Black people. We're talking about people who do live on the margins of society, who do live under some of those lack of social protections that I mentioned. There are special circumstances there that one needs to look at that unfortunately society does tend to overlook. So when this big development project was happening, nobody's recognized what were some of the unintended consequences of that movement, and it led to a lawsuit. It led to a lot of things, So I would say that expect such scenarios to happen, and ask yourself, what are the unintended consequences of my managed retreat or planned relocation? Because I'll tell you, some of the unintended consequences of planned relocation are: one, it's very interesting how there's money for planned relocation for the rich, and there isn't enough money for all the things that are destabilizing already poor people. And two, it's really interesting how we're moving people who already have means, but we're not necessarily moving people who have been at risk for about 30, 40, 50 years.
Yeah, I appreciate you bringing that up. That is very interesting. Especially when we think about that term displacement. I find that interesting myself.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not shocked. I'm just...
Yeah, humanitarians that use that. I sat up and I was like, wow, this is interesting. Urban planners are using this term. Yeah.
That amazes me. I guess I'm not shocked, but it is interesting, the wordplay there. I do want to follow that thread. I want to pull this thread a little bit and talk about, inclusive development planning. Can we talk about how, legislators can be better, or what should they think about when, we're talking about building for the future, building resilience for the future, and how we can make sure that we're being inclusive when we do that?
I'll take a start at that. So one of the things that happened in New York City is that we recognized that we needed to densify our transportation hubs, and we put in a law called mandatory inclusionary housing. So you're allowed to build your buildings higher, but 10% has to be for folks who are below certain income levels. And then that way we're able to make sure that these communities are mixed economically. In fact, there's a rezoning about to happen in Soho, where, as you can imagine, Soho in New York City is a very moneyed place. And we recognize as a city that it's inland, it's not in the floodplain, and it's near lots of transportation. Some of the folks who live there are not pleased, but it's very important for us to have people throughout the city and not just congregated on places that are not necessarily the safest for them. So that's something that New York City actually legislated. So just wanted to give that as an example.
Muted myself again. That's a great example. We are coming down to time. We have less than 10 minutes. Amali, if you want to respond, I'm gonna do that. And then I'm gonna grab Tina's second question in the chat here. Okay.
No, let's go for it.
All right, great. Second question coming from Tina. So we have to start designating shoreline property as a wasted asset. We have to be careful that wealthy investors don't use municipal resources to compensate losses for bad investment. I think that was a comment, or if there is any, reaction you have to that, I welcome it.
I actually do, because in New York City, unlike very many places around the world and even around the United States, it's poorer people that live with the shorelines. So 30%, I think, of our public housing stock is at the shore. So that's why it's Coney Island houses, Far Rockaway houses, Red Hook houses, East River houses, where actually Luther Vandross was born. All of those are housing developments owned by New York City Public Housing that are on the beach or on the shore or near the water. So New York City is not the same as other places. So we have to also look at the fact that that was a problem we had when people were renting and they weren't able to get any of the FEMA money. Where we're going to put those folks until we got their power back. So we have to make sure that we remember that some places it is actually the people of lesser means who live near the water. And that might be the case with river flooding. You might have people living along a river or a delta area where it's actually not wealthy people, but the poorer people who live in those areas. So we just need to remember that it's active mixed use in some places.
I'm going to end with a directed question for each of you. I have one for you, Lolita, here in the chat. In your work as a special advisor for climate policy and programs for the New York Mayor's Office, New York City's Mayor's Office, what policy successes did you see? And what policies have you advocated for that haven't yet been implemented? And then I'm gonna close with my question to Amali about climate refugees, and I want to suss out that term a little bit.
Sure. So really quickly, the things that were successes is when we came out with our plan for Hurricane Sandy, we had 270 different initiatives that we put as different plans for around the city. So it wasn't just a big firewall, flood wall, it was different neighborhood solutions. And many of those solutions have been done, including $1 billion of drainage and sewer infrastructure in some of the poor communities in Queens. And I can go on, but a lot of those things actually have happened. So I'm very proud of that work. The thing that hasn't happened, 2007, we proposed congestion pricing. We're still talking about it. It still hasn't happened. And that will help with emissions and air quality issues in many neighborhoods throughout New York City, and also better subway connections. There are many transportation deserts in places where a lot of people who don't have means live. So if we made that transportation infrastructure more robust, they wouldn't have to drive their cars in the first place. So those are the things that I would love to see happen.
Thank you so much for that. And I welcome you both, but I had Amali in mind when I thought about this, because the term climate refugees does not exist in international refugee law. So I want to talk about what barriers that creates for those who are displaced as a result of climate-related events, and what can be done to expand protections to those individuals, and what role can state legislators play. That is a mouthful, but I invite you both. I want to ask Amali, because she, her organization is called Climate Refugees. So if you can just talk about that a little bit before we close here.
Sure. Yes. So you're absolutely right. It's because the 1951 Refugee Convention didn't foresee climate change when it was, enshrined that way. So the only things that cover somebody under the convention really are, to be persecuted and to be fleeing conflict. And you have to be persecuted for one of 5 grounds, and that's race, religion, nationality, political opinion, social group. So climate change doesn't apply. However, we have some legal guidance as of last year from UNHCR, from the UN Refugee Agency, that basically says says a lot of the things that, which is why I founded my organization, to say that there's a lot in human rights law, and there's a lot in like regional refugee instruments, that and also the fact that the climate change doesn't exactly work in this way, to where a disaster comes along, you're moved. It's the slow onset impacts of climate change and how that interacts, as I said, with those social protections, with political economy. Imagine what it looks like to have environmental degradation or slow onset impacts that lead to consecutive droughts, where 80% of your population lives off the land, right? And your entire economy is agrarian, or is based on pastoralism. What does that look like? So enter the Sahel, for example. No wonder we're talking about food security and conflict, and you can see how that destabilizes a place. So you can see how persecution and what I might have described under the convention does have some nexus and some intersection and so there are some legal guidance that says people who would find themselves to be a persecuted class may find that climate change exacerbates that, and or you may find that those who are already impacted by climate change might be further persecuted because of the marginalization that they already suffer in their countries. Area of overlap, but I would say the greatest problem is the fact that regardless of whether, across the board, what we're seeing in democratic states, in weak states, in authoritarian governments, you're seeing a reluctance to abide by protections towards refugees, migrants. You're seeing a very anti-immigrant sentiment, and we've been seeing this for quite some time, and I don't expect that to change. So whether we have an expansion of the definition, whether we have an understanding, or whether I say to you and convince you here, Rukia, that human rights law applies to migrants, it really has no bearing on the fact that how do we get people to respect it, when, point of fact, even though we have the convention, we still have states that have acceded to it who don't abide by it, for the very people that do fall under that definition. So even though we now have people who are also being displaced for reasons other than those 5 grounds, we still have states that aren't abiding by the convention anyway. So climate refugees exist, and so do a lot of other people now, to say that people are being forced to move for reasons that are far more complex than just the convention envisioned, and it's really about documenting that reality and trying to explain that circumstance that I just tried to quickly explain in 3-4 minutes.
Can I just add to that very concrete examples that people think are due to war or conflict, actually their derivation is from climate. So Syria had a significant drought for a number of years before everything that happened there. And a lot of the migrants from Central America is because there was a drought that they couldn't grow crops there. So we're going to see more of this. I would pay close attention to Afghanistan, not just because of the Taliban and war, but there's a drought there as well. So we're going to continue to see things that are attributed to other items. Actually, the derivation is climate.
Well, Afghanistan, over 50% of the country is incredibly food insecure. Madagascar is the only country in the world right now who is at famine purely only because of climate change. There are 34 provinces in Afghanistan. Every single one of them has had a climate-related disaster.
Wow.
So there you go.
I think you all did a phenomenal job of explaining that. Thank you. And what little time we have left, we do have a little bit of a 5-minute buffer, a break between the next panel, but I want to thank you both so much for being here with me today.